Brian Katulis with us, Center for American Progress on Libya, among other things. What have you learned in the last 24 hours, Brian, about Libya? Away from the media, when you think about things, what have you observed or what have you learned?
Well, look, it's a deeply divided country. We kind of knew that Gaddafi ruled it with an iron fist. But what we've seen in the last day or so is some very vicious fighting, that even under the cover of air that the United States and Britain and others have offered, there's still a lot of fighting on the ground and deep internal divisions. It's a civil war, and we've actually come in on the side of the rebels.
I'm going to do my Peter Cook imitation now and just simply say to you there are tensions in Washington over this event, this war, this conflict, whatever you want to call it. What would you presume to see out of Washington in the coming days and weeks as senators and congressmen consider what the executive branch has done?
Well, I think you're going to hear a bunch of tough questions from both Democrats and Republicans alike. Leaders from both parties were concerned about how the president did not consult them adequately in their view. I think the central question that they're going to be asking, which is a question we all need to ask, is what we're trying to do here. What's the end goal? Because if you listen to President Obama, he says that Gaddafi must step down and leave. But if you read the text of the UN resolution 1973, which authorized this military action, says nothing about regime change. It just says about protecting the civilian population. What does that mean? That means actually, the rebels that are trying to take back territory that Gaddafi took over the last week or two, may actually fight it to a stalemate, and we could be in this awkward situation where Gaddafi's in power in the western part, and you've got rebels in the eastern part, and we're still doing a new no-fly zone with an open-ended commitment.
Is this about oil?
Well, I think part of it is about oil. Libya is a small percentage when you compare it to Saudi Arabia or Qatar and the Gulf, where I was last week. I think a big part of it for European countries is this. The worry that Libyan migrants and immigrants would come on massive waves to Italy, France, and other places. That's, I think, part of the reason why you see France and Britain and others taking a primary lead, or at least saying they will. And let's see if they'll actually step up. Well,
I want to talk about that in a second. Here's a chart, folks, that really amazed me. This is per capita GDP, obviously Libya working off a very, very low base, normalized back 10 years. And the white line is Libya. And you've got the U.S., and you've got Italy there just beneath the U.S. And I don't think there's any surprise the blue line's below the yellow line. But there's Libya with some real growth there. I mean, it's a very difficult society, Brian, but in your study of the Middle East, characterize the youth and the unrest and the poverty of Libya versus these other countries.
Well, it's quite similar to these other countries demographically in that more than half of the population is under the age of 25. It's a little dissimilar in that it's a very tribal society. The divisions that we see in places like Egypt or even Syria or Yemen, which may be along political lines, it's very tribal in a place like Libya, even to this day. And I think what Gaddafi's done is he's not only ruled with an iron fist, as you demonstrated with that chart, he's actually tried to use some of the oil wealth to buy off key power sectors. And I think a couple of weeks ago, if you asked people at the White House, they thought Gaddafi might fall pretty easily. I think what they're finding is that his inner circle and the patronage networks he's developed using oil money in part are quite resilient.
Do we have a foreign policy in the Middle East? Do we have a long-term policy?
No, we don't. I mean, this is part of the problem. Since 1979, I would say, we've actually been in this crisis management, tactical, reactive mode. We've engaged in a number of wars, but we've never really clearly articulated what it is we actually want to see in the region. We have interests. We want to secure the oil supply, and I think we've done a fine job doing that, more or less. But I think we need to start thinking about what it is we need to do to make sure that we're not getting engaged in every single civil war that appears in the Middle East.
Brian, you and Kate Gordon have written recently, Center for American Progress, on confronting new Saudi realities. What is the new reality we have to confront with a royalty as King Abdullah ages?
Well, King Abdullah was in the United States for about 3 or 4 months. Earlier this year and then late last year, he was quite ill. We're going to see a leadership transition there at some point. And the succession issues are not very clear. You've got at least 5,000 Saudis with some sort of princely rank. So we may be looking at some sort of complicated and opaque succession crisis in the world's largest oil and gas producer. I think the way that the Saudi forces responded to events next door in Bahrain by sending forces in is a leading indicator of what we might expect over the next few years inside of Saudi Arabia.
It all goes back to oil. Earlier this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance, I spoke with Stephen Schork of the Schork Report, his outlook for gasoline prices.
You look at the global markets, Brent crude oil, West African crude oil. A lot of the crude oils that come into the East Coast refinery system, they're all trading at $115, $120 a barrel. Again, if we run the regressions, that's going to translate to East Coast gasoline this summer close to, if not above, $4 a gallon. And like I said, at that level, the elasticities of demand come into play, and we will see weaker demand.
Bloomberg Surveillance 7 to 10, drive time in New York, of course. Brian Katulis, you're at Steve Schork there. Talk about the dreaded phrase for any politician, $4 a gallon, that working off of Brent. I'm going to ask you this question again. Is this all about oil?
I think at the core of it, we wouldn't be in the Middle East with more than 150,000 troops if they just produced carrots. And it's a big part of what drives our economy and the global economy. And I would add increasingly, when I look at it from a global perspective, the increased demand from China and other growing countries. I'm no economist, but I could see these prices just going up, up, and up.
Very good, Brian. Let's leave it there. Brian Katulis with us.